Hello everyone, wishing you a wonderful day. Today we're diving into a story of tough choices and impossible decisions. What happens when love and family clash, and one man must choose between his past and his future? Stay with me to discover how it all unfolds. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next videos. The air in the car felt thick. Tieu Lac sat in the back seat, her eyes fixed on the road outside, but her thoughts were far away. The city loomed ahead, and though she didn't say it, she could feel the weight of what was coming. She glanced at the CEO sitting next to her. His eyes were on the road, but his mind? She wasn't sure. He had been quiet since they left the hospital in the small town, a place she had known for so long, and now everything was changing. The city was a world she wasn't sure she could ever truly fit into. The noise, the lights, the constant movement. It was nothing like the peaceful life she had once known. But now it was all about the baby. Their baby. And it wasn't just about the baby's health anymore, it was about everything else. His mother, his family, the life they would build, or wouldn't. She glanced down at the baby in her arms. The small life that had already gone through so much, but still fought. She whispered softly, "We're almost there. Just hold on, okay?" The baby stirred slightly, and Tieu Lac's heart fluttered. She had never imagined that a mother could feel such fierce love. Love that was both beautiful and terrifying. She wanted so much for this to work, for the baby to be okay. But she wasn't sure what would come next. And neither was he. The CEO's grip on the wheel tightened slightly. She didn't need to look at him to know he was just as uncertain as she was. The drive to the city was long, and every mile seemed to stretch further, but not just in distance. It stretched the space between the two of them. He wanted to believe that everything would be okay, but deep down, he couldn't ignore the pressure that was building. His mother was already waiting for them in the city. She had made sure of that. Everything had already been planned for them. The doctors, the specialists, the high-end hospital, the best of the best. But she had also made it clear that Tieu Lac wasn't part of that plan. Not in the way he had hoped. The CEO's mother had never accepted Tieu Lac. She hadn't even given her a chance. In her eyes, the situation was simple. Tieu Lac was not someone who could fit into their world. Not someone who was worthy of being part of this family. And that was the unspoken truth that he had been avoiding for too long. When they finally arrived at the city hospital, everything felt overwhelming. The lights were brighter, the floors gleamed in their sterile perfection. Doctors and nurses moved quickly, purposefully. It was a world far from the simplicity of their home, but it was the only chance they had for the baby. Tieu Lac felt the tension in her chest grow as they walked through the halls. The baby's small body felt fragile in her arms, and though she tried to stay calm, she could feel the uncertainty weighing down on her. "This way," the CEO said quietly, leading her to a private room. The door opened and a nurse stepped in, giving them a polite but professional smile. "Everything is prepared for the tests," the nurse said, her voice calm and efficient. "Please take a seat." Tieu Lac sat down, cradling the baby in her arms, her heart racing. The CEO stayed standing, his eyes scanning the room, clearly lost in thought. It wasn't long before they were joined by a doctor, who introduced himself briefly and began discussing the tests. "Given her premature birth, we need to conduct several examinations to check for any potential heart conditions. The sooner we know, the sooner we can start treatment." Tieu Lac nodded, trying to absorb everything, but her mind kept drifting to one thing: his mother, the woman who had never accepted her, who would be waiting for them outside, the woman who would never accept her place in the CEO's life, no matter what. Later that day, the CEO stepped out of the room to make a call. Tieu Lac stayed by the baby's side, watching the machines hum quietly, her mind racing. When the CEO returned, his face was unreadable. He didn't say anything immediately, just sat down beside her. "Everything will be okay," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Tieu Lac looked at him, trying to find the comfort in his words. She wanted to believe him. She needed to believe him. But something inside her told her that nothing would ever be the same after today. His phone buzzed, breaking the silence. He glanced at it before answering. "Yes, Mother," he said flatly. "I'm with Tieu Lac now." "Yes, we're waiting for the results." Tieu Lac's stomach tightened at the mention of his mother's name. She didn't need to hear the conversation to know what was coming. She had seen this before. The distance, the coldness, the way he was pulled between two worlds. His family and her. The CEO looked at her after hanging up the phone. "My mother has arranged for us to meet with the best specialists. She's already made all the arrangements." Tieu Lac nodded, though she didn't feel reassured. She wanted to trust him. She wanted to believe that things would work out, that the baby would get the care she needed. But the cold truth was that everything was being controlled by someone else. "I know," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. He looked at her with concern. "Are you okay?" She forced a smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "I'm fine." But they both knew that wasn't true. The next day, as they waited for the results, the CEO's mother finally arrived at the hospital. The CEO had said nothing about her visit, but Tieu Lac could feel the change in the air when she walked in. She was elegant, as always, dressed in an immaculate suit that screamed wealth and control. She didn't look at Tieu Lac when she entered the room. Her gaze went directly to the baby, her expression unreadable. The CEO's mother stood silently for a moment, as if measuring the situation. Then she spoke. "We need to talk." Her voice was cool, authoritative. The CEO shifted slightly, his jaw tightening. "Mother, Don't interrupt," she said sharply, cutting him off. Then she turned her attention to Tieu Lac, who was holding the baby carefully in her arms. "I don't think you understand what this means," she said to Tieu Lac, her tone cold, calculating. "You're not meant to be a part of this family, and you never will be." Tieu Lac felt the sting of her words, but she didn't flinch. She knew this moment would come. It had always been inevitable. She looked at the CEO, waiting for him to speak up, to defend her. But he stayed silent, his eyes dark with frustration. His mother continued, her voice even sharper now. "I've arranged for you to stay somewhere else, Tieu Lac. Somewhere where you and the baby will be taken care of. You'll be compensated for the inconvenience." The words stung, but Tieu Lac held her ground. "I'm not going anywhere," she said quietly. The CEO didn't speak at first. He looked at his mother, then back at Tieu Lac, as if trying to decide what to say, what to do. His mother raised an eyebrow. "You think you can just keep her here?" He finally spoke. "No, I'm choosing my family. I'm choosing Tieu Lac and our daughter. That's what matters." The words were final, resolute, and for the first time, he was making a choice for himself. Tieu Lac couldn't stop the tears that started to fall, but this time, they were different. They weren't filled with fear. They were filled with hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, they could build something real together. The tension in the room was thick. The CEO stood his ground, facing his mother with a look that said everything he needed to. He wasn't going to back down. Not this time. Tieu Lac, still holding the baby, felt a mix of emotions swirling inside her. Relief, fear, hope. She hadn't expected the CEO to defend her so fiercely, not after everything his mother had done. But here he was, making a choice for their family. She was still trying to absorb it all. The CEO's mother stared at him for a long moment, her eyes cold, calculating. But for the first time in their long history of silent battles, she didn't speak immediately. She just watched him, as if trying to figure out whether his defiance was a momentary lapse or a permanent change. Finally, she spoke. "You think this will end well?" Her voice was calm, but there was an edge to it now. "You're making a mistake. You're throwing everything away for a woman who doesn't belong here." And for a child, Tieu Lac flinched, but she didn't look away. This wasn't the time to back down. "I am not just some woman," she said quietly, her voice steady but firm. "And this baby is everything to me. Everything." The CEO's mother's gaze flickered to the baby in Tieu Lac's arms, and for a second there was something like hesitation in her eyes. But it was gone before anyone could say anything. "The tests have been scheduled," she said coldly, ignoring Tieu Lac's words. "And I expect you to be reasonable. You can't keep living in this small town. You can't raise her like this. You'll need resources, facilities, and a future that's secure. You can't do that here." The CEO's jaw clenched tighter. He turned his back to his mother briefly, his eyes landing on Tieu Lac, who was still holding the baby close. "I don't need your money," he said. His voice was low but resolute. "I don't need your arrangement. All I need is time with my family. With her." Tieu Lac could see how hard he was fighting to keep his emotions in check. She knew this wasn't just about her or the baby. It was about everything he had been raised to believe. The wealth, the power, the status that his family believed was the only way to live. But for him, right now, it was about choosing something else. His mother took a deep breath, and her eyes narrowed. "You may think you're making the right choice, but you're blind. You can't build a future on love alone. It's not enough." "Then I guess I'll figure it out," he replied, his voice softer, but his resolve never wavering. He turned back to Tieu Lac and the baby, walking toward them. For the first time, he truly felt the weight of his own choices, but it was a weight he was willing to carry. That evening, after the visit from his mother, things remained tense between the CEO and Tieu Lac. But in a way, the words that had been spoken had given them clarity. He was determined to stay with her, with their daughter, no matter the cost. But reality was catching up quickly. The next morning, the CEO woke early. He hadn't slept much, his mind swirling with thoughts of the future. His mother's words echoed in his mind, repeatedly. She was right about one thing. Money was running out quickly. The resources they needed to stay in the city, the treatments for their baby, the apartment to keep them safe, all of it would require money. And fast. He looked at Tieu Lac, still sleeping beside him, exhausted from the emotional roller coaster of the past days. The baby was still resting peacefully in her arms. He stepped out of the room quietly, leaving his phone on the table. He didn't want to hear another word from his mother right now. Instead, he needed to think of his own way. He walked out into the city, trying to clear his mind. The noise of the streets, the fast-moving cars, the chatter of the people. It felt too overwhelming. But the reality of the situation hit him the moment he stepped into a small, quiet cafe to grab a coffee. He looked at the menu, his mind still lost in the uncertainty of their future, when a voice behind him startled him. "You look like someone who could use a break." The CEO turned around to see an older man, dressed casually, holding a coffee cup in his hand. The man was smiling, his expression friendly but weathered. He raised an eyebrow but smiled faintly. "You could say that?" The man chuckled. "You look like you're trying to figure something out." "Let me guess. Family?" The CEO was about to answer when the man added, "I've been there. Tough situation, I'm guessing." The CEO nodded slowly, surprised by the man's straightforwardness. "Yeah," he said, letting out a slow breath. "It's been a rough couple of days." "Take a seat." The man gestured to the empty chair across from him. "Let me guess. Your life isn't what you thought it would be. You were on top and now you're, what? Trying to rebuild everything?" The CEO sat down, not sure why he was sharing so much with this stranger, but there was something about the man's presence that felt genuine. "Yeah," the CEO replied. "Something like that." The man smiled kindly, his eyes full of understanding. The thing with money is, it doesn't fix everything, but it makes some things easier. You're going to have to figure out how to get by without it, and that's the real challenge. The CEO took a deep breath. I'm not sure where to start. My mother's giving me an ultimatum, and it's not an easy one to ignore. The older man's expression softened. Well, family has a way of complicating things, but you're going to have to make a choice, and it's probably not going to be the easy one. But you know what? You've got your family right there, by your side. That's what matters. The CEO looked down at the table for a moment, processing the man's words. He had always known that money didn't fix everything. But hearing it from someone else, from a stranger, made him realize just how far he had strayed from the life that truly mattered. I'll figure it out, he said quietly, more to himself than the man. The older man nodded, finishing his coffee. You will. Just remember, sometimes the hardest choice is the one that brings you back to where you belong. That evening, when he returned to the apartment, the weight of the decision still pressed down on him. But for the first time, he felt a flicker of clarity. He didn't have to give in to his mother's demands. He didn't have to let go of the family he had fought for. Tieu Lac was waiting for him, the baby resting peacefully between them. He walked in, quietly sitting down beside her. I'm going to figure this out, he said softly. I promise. Tieu Lac didn't ask how or what he meant. She simply nodded, understanding the depth of his resolve. And in that quiet, uncertain moment, they were both ready to face whatever came next.